these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back to Hold These Truths, greatest podcast ever if you like learning stuff. Today we're thrilled to have Dr. Alexander Burns. He's a distinguished historian who specializes in 18th century Atlantic world and military history, brings a wealth of knowledge on the intricate dynamics of the period from transatlantic exchanges to the experiences of soldiers in the American Continental Army during the Revolutionary War. Expert on all things of back in the day of 18th century trade, warfare, cultural exchange, how it all shaped history, delves into the lives of ordinary soldiers, the strategic decisions of military leaders, and the broader context of global empires competing for dominance. So we'll unpack all of that. Dr. Burns, thanks for being on.
It's great to be on, Congressman. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, you're I'm always telling my staff to find interesting guests, and is 300 something episodes we've done, and we've actually done a pretty good job, I think, finding interesting people. There's no shortage of them, and I'm going to enjoy this one because I love learning about history of this time period. I don't think any of us know enough. But you came across our radar because one of your tweets went semi-viral, just kind of talking about why education is the problem that it is, or higher ed, let's say. And you had a really good thread that really brought some receipts. I mean, you dove into like especially which dissertations were gaining traction, and maybe explain that a little bit. Let's kind of start there. But then I want to move on into the history stuff because I find that much more interesting. I've done plenty of podcasts on why higher ed sucks, But you had an interesting point of view, so maybe summarize that for us, and let's talk about that, and then let's get into what it's like being a soldier in the Continental Army, because that's really what I'm interested in.
That sounds great. So, yeah, I've worked in higher education now for the last 12 years at a variety of both Christian and public and secular colleges. It is disheartening in some ways to see the challenges. I do think at its core, higher education is one of the great strengths in the United States. I mean, if you compare our educational system to something like Poland or Germany, I mean, or the United Kingdom, they're all very envious of what we have.
Of course, yeah, because I don't like to start to interrupt. I don't like the sort of the overreaction that some people have, which is don't send your kids to college anymore. I'm like, just pump the brakes, Yeah,
I mean, it's still a vital step on the road into the middle class in America, which is, what we want, right? But with that said, I do think that there is a growing sense of entitlement. There are problems with grade inflation. I mean, you look at this not just as sort of the smaller regional colleges that I've worked at, but even Ivy League colleges, like Yale, where like the average grade is like an A or an A minus, and it's the average grade, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I went to Harvard. It's definitely A minus, A minus, probably average. A plus, very, very hard to get though. I mean,
sure.
It's just the scale though it should be. I thought average was C, but
hey, yeah, me too. When I started, way back when in at a small Bible college in Indiana. But no, so it seems like in some ways the cost of higher education is skyrocketing on the part of the students. And I always try to use free online textbooks to save my kids money where I can. But there are a lot of costs associated with that dollar value. One of the costs, I think, is more and more students view, because they're paying so much money, education is an entitlement. The professor is there to give them an A because they're already paying a lot for college. And so in some ways because the costs are ballooning, we're inflating grades in response to that. And it's a challenge that I think a lot of professors are trying to deal with. Professors themselves are under a lot of pressure as a result of needing to get tenure and things like this. And so to get tenure, you have to have great student evaluations. Well, the students will give you good evaluations if they're happy with the class, if they're getting a good grade, and so there's pressure on the faculty to sort of make the class easier, perhaps in order to get these good student evaluations. And so there's problems with inflated costs, problems of entitlement. All of these are coming together and I don't know, in some ways corrupting maybe the higher education system that set America apart from the rest of the world in the 60s and 70s.
Well, can you go into the details you went into on that? I don't know if you have them just on hand memory, but
Sure.
you had some interesting facts that I think made your point about like how the incentive structures have changed in order to get tenure, in order to get to those, into the higher, more established, I guess the higher end universities, and what you have to do your
Sure.
PhD in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what today in modern academia, in order to get a tenure track position as an academic, which is what I have now, at a large, R1 is what we call them, like the highest rank in terms of research dollars, university, you really need to be researching topics that are trendy, that really connect to current events, that connect to current political issues. It helps if you are obviously are at an Ivy League university. And so what we're seeing, I think, increasingly is be a lack of diversity in thought. There are less conservatives in higher education than there were,
No.
40 years ago. There are more scholars focused on the history of gender, the history of society broadly, and these things are vital. But if the pie is only so large, you have less political historians, you have less military historians, and so those subjects are being taught less and less. In some ways, if you are a military historian, if you're a political historian, or even a diplomatic historian, you're sort of looked down on.
Hmm.
I went for my PhD, Regional State University in Appalachia, and my department chair was shocked. We taught military history to ROTC cadets as part of their program.
Hmm.
And my department chair was shocked that every semester we would offer 6 sections of the modern U.S. military survey, and it would fill the capacity. Students would be waiting to get in. And for me and the other military historians teaching that, our response is, wow, well, this makes sense. Students are interested in military history. It's one of the most, enduring parts of the past in terms of holding the public's interests. Why, so many period pieces are, in terms of film, are set during conflicts. But my department chair's response was, well, we have really traditional students because we teach in Appalachia. And so, it can be challenging to confront those biases on
Yeah.
the part of people who are senior to you. If you're maybe a historian, more traditional outlook, someone who focuses on political events or military events or diplomatic events. If you look at where chronologically the research is occurring. I mean, I still am of the mindset that we can learn a huge amount from the classical world and the Greeks and the Romans, the Punic Wars. Certainly we can learn things from the period that I study, the American Revolution. But more and more, in order to check that box of relevancy, historians are studying topics from 1800 to the present.
Yeah.
So folks on the Civil War, maybe, but really focused on the events of the 20th century. Now, we need that stuff covered, but do we need it covered to the exclusion of all else? I think that's the question.
Yeah, it's also the way they cover it. It's like, well, we're going to study gender. And it's like, well, what do you mean the history of gender? I can tell you the history of gender. There's been two genders pretty much forever.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not to make a joke about it, but like,
I mean, I do
that's
think that like you can study even something like the Continental Army and study how women were involved in the
yeah,
work
that's could be
of
an
the
interesting
Continental Army.
subject for sure.
But in terms of, do we want to offer a ton of classes on subjects like this that are sort of maybe modern and trendy, and exclude political history, exclude diplomatic history, exclude military history,
What I see
especially.
is what I see is an exclusion of the basics, and I think that this is one of the problems I've seen in education, not just higher ed, but even just in high school, where there's this assumption that academics have begun to have, which is the kids already know the basics, so let's go off the beaten path a little bit. Let's teach the anti-history. I'm
Yeah,
kind of coining that phrase, but I think it makes sense. Like, let's teach the counter narratives.
yeah,
But you got to
absolutely.
teach the narrative first. You got to teach what's basically established first
Mm,
before you start, I think, exposing kids to these trendy counter narratives that can be useful for critical thinking. I don't want to deny that, but but it can go too far. I mean, the 1619 project being the
mhm.
ultimate case of like you're just trying to upend what is basic truth
Mhm.
by implementing a counter narrative, and that can go too far. Like there's a critical thinking is good, counterfactuals are good, but you got to be careful with it. Moving into what you study, which again I think is a more interesting topic. So what was your dissertation on?
Yeah, so I looked specifically at ordinary soldiers' lives in Britain, in like the United Kingdom, and in Prussia in the 1700s. So connected to our American Revolution, I looked at some letters from British
Yeah.
soldiers who fought against us in the Revolution, but more focused on the period maybe just before our Revolution, what we call the French and Indian War, what globally they call the Seven Years' War.
Okay, so what do we learn from that? How do you get these letters? Where are these
Yeah,
letters?
yeah,
Like
absolutely. It's a
how does one
really good
even
question.
start to like do their research on something like this? Can you just
So,
Google like soldier letters? I don't think so.
yeah, it's a really good question, and for many years, kind of the narrative out there was 18th century soldiers didn't write very much. That most of them were illiterate, and I think that's to some degree that I think that's still true, especially in certain European nations. But in Protestant European nations with a higher literacy rate in the 18th century, countries like essentially what is northern Germany today, England, Scandinavia, there are a lot of even common people who can read and write as a result of that sort of religious education and focus on being able to read scripture. And so as a result of that, kind of armed with that knowledge, I thought, I bet if I really dig, I can find some letters from common soldiers. And so there weren't many. In the course of my dissertation, I think I found like 211.
Seems
But
like a good
compared to,
amount, but where are you digging? Where when you say dig, like
yeah,
where are you going
so like
to find?
local archives in Germany, in the United Kingdom, not the big kind of national archives that usually, if you're a military historian, you think I study institutions, right? I'm going to go to the our National Army Museum. I'm going to go to the National Archives and see the military records. Well,
Hmm.
that's not where letters are preserved. Letters, if they're saved at all, and most of them weren't saved because the patriotism and nationalism aren't quite on the scene yet. Most of them are in local county archives where family
Hmm.
correspondence is kind of stashed. And so by
Yeah,
turning away from big institutions and kind of looking more on the local level, I was able to find the sample size of
that's a
letters.
lot of work,
It was. It was.
a lot of time to, I'm sure, track all that down.
Yeah, it
And
took
so,
about 2 years of archival research. Yeah.
and so then, you've done all the research. I mean, what was, what was your thesis? Do you even
Sure.
start with that, or do you kind of just start with like, I want to focus on this issue, and then maybe a thesis develops out of this?
Yeah, I think it kind of depends, right? My advisor, Catherine Asta, who's tragically passed now, she was much more of that second camp. So you kind of let the sources drive what you want your thesis to be. Um, I tried to look at maybe not what we would want from these soldiers, but try to understand them on their own terms. Try to look at the things that were important to them, so like local community and sort of their faith. And so I analyzed the like religious language in these letters. A lot of the soldiers in the UK or like the British Army, the Redcoats, they were Methodists. Methodism was kind of emerging at this time. It was a sort of a new religious movement in the 18th century. In Prussia, a lot of the common soldiers, most of them were Lutheran. Some of them were pietist Lutherans, which is sort of a similar, more like emotive or expressive version of Christianity or Protestant Christianity that was sort of coming about at this time. So I looked at those questions, and then I also tried to look at the way that the government tried to monopolize and use the narratives that were out there in society to its advantage. Soldiers are more loyal if there's small unit cohesion, right? And so for these men, that didn't necessarily look like unit pride, although in some cases there are examples of unit pride. It
Yeah.
looked like recruiting locally. And so you have like your cousins and your nephews and your uncles all in the same unit with you. And so you don't want to essentially leave your family in the lurch on the battlefield.
Yeah.
And so there's a great deal, especially in the Prussian army, of small unit cohesion as a result of that. And one of the things I looked at was the British kind of notice this, and they try and adopt a similar system, putting men from the same local communities in the same units as the 18th century goes on.
That's interesting. And so, well, then what did end up being your conclusion of within the research? I mean, what did end up being your thesis that you try to prove, or I don't know how to describe it. I'm not an
Yeah,
academic.
no, absolutely. So I guess my thesis, essentially what I argued was it was sort of more successful in Prussia than it was in England. The English reform attempts were not fully successful.
Mhm.
They tried to implement almost like this sense of local identity in the units, and in some cases it worked, and in some cases it didn't. But kind of more broadly, I tried to argue that when we understand 18th century soldiers, we have to do it through the lens of kind of their own worldview, local communities, and
Mhm.
religion. Um, the way that specific religious movements were used by these states in order to create small unit cohesion.
And what are their
And
lives like? How do they? How does your typical British soldier end up in the British Army? Are they? I'm not. Just excuse my ignorance. I mean, is there a draft? Is it a volunteer army? Like how did it work back then?
yeah, so it's different in different European countries, and even in the States. We can talk about that when we get to the Revolution. Um, Most British soldiers are there volunteers. It's not quite an all volunteer army, but it's close. You have a few instances in the 18th century where they kind of tried out the idea of conscription, but the vast majority of soldiers, particularly in the British Army, are volunteers. And this is one of the questions that I looked at in my dissertation. It's hard to recruit men all from the same local community if you're doing it on an all volunteer basis.
Yeah,
So in Britain, you do have some men from the same counties,
sure.
but a lot of them are drawn from all over the country, where essentially wherever the recruiting sergeant is going throughout the
Hmm.
country, trying to drum up.
A little bit more like modern America today. You know,
Yeah, to a
the
large extent.
the
Yeah,
idea of having a unit of the from a similar community is I would actually argue against it.
sure.
As just as being a military guy myself, like I
Yeah,
would prefer diversity. For one thing, you don't want one community taking all of the casualties. That's bad. I mean, in World War II, Saving Private Ryan is about this exact problem, right? You can't have too many brothers dying all at the same time. It's not how you want to run things. Another thing I'm curious about in those letters is again, just coming from my own military experience, where we fight wars very differently now than we did back then. We don't line up, as it turns out, on big fields and then shoot right at each other. That just seems absolutely insane to me.
Mhm.
And yet this was just how warfare was conducted for so long. And
Mhm.
when we get to the American Revolution, I'd love to dive into it was a mix of both, right? A mix of that traditional confrontation, but a little bit of guerrilla warfare, which is how, of course, I would prefer to do it.
Mhm.
Um, do they talk about that in letters? Like, does a British soldier ever say, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't wear bright red because
Yeah.
it's like a freaking target for the enemy"? Like, does that even come up?
So this is actually what my book that's coming out on Thursday is about.
Oh, you got a book
It's
coming out
called
on
Infantry
Thursday?
in Battle,
Okay.
and it is looking certainly at America, but also these European armies. They did question this, and to some extent, um, 18th century combat is kind of about negotiated authority between the enlisted men and the officers. The
Hmm.
officers would really like them to fight the way you see in the movies. They want
Hmm.
the men to all line up, kind of march into close range, maybe 100 yards or less, and open fire, with a volley at the enemy. That's the officer's ideal picture for how the battle's going to go. The
Why?
soldiers have no interest in this at all.
But why
They
did even the
will
officers? Because like, I mean, fucking officers, that's just for any of the veterans listening to this. It's
sure.
like, of course, the
Yeah,
officers would want that. I hate. I'm an officer, so like I get it all the time.
absolutely. I mean,
But
but the soldiers, they say, let's shoot at a longer range. Let's shoot like 250 yards. We don't
maybe we
want to
should
get close to the
flank.
enemy.
Maybe we should hide in the trees.
Yeah,
I don't know.
absolutely. Yeah,
Like maybe
yeah.
we should have cover and
And
movement.
that's the thing.
Like
So even outside of our American Revolution, in the wars over in Europe, a lot of the soldiers, if they see the enemy getting ready to fire, they'll all throw themselves to the ground. They'll all get behind a wall. They
yeah.
do take cover on the battlefield.
Okay, so it's not quite like the movies where they just keep
Yeah,
standing and just fall. Like there's some sense of self-preservation in real life.
absolutely.
That makes a lot more sense. I guess yeah, I mean it's a fascinating subject. And how accurate was the movie? Did you see the movie Napoleon with
Ooh.
Joaquin Phoenix? I mean
Yeah, yeah. I
that
did
was
a couple of
interesting.
big threads on that on Twitter.
Yeah. Oh, really?
Yeah.
What was the most inaccurate part of that?
Um,
It was an
man.
entertaining movie for somebody who doesn't really
Yeah,
know much about
it was
Napoleon.
a visually stunning man. So there were things that really jarred me as a historian. Like we skipped huge parts of his life and huge parts of the
Well,
narrative. I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
already a 4 hour
it's a
movie,
movie.
so like,
What are you gonna do? It's a movie.
yeah,
But
exactly. But I would say when at Waterloo, when like the Duke of Wellington is talking to the
mhm,
rifleman and the guy's got a big scope on his rifle,
yeah,
like that totally like jarred me. There were not scoped rifles in the 18th century. Um,
they didn't even have that scope. Yeah, that didn't even exist.
yeah, by the time of the Civil War, it starts to, but
Yeah.
that's not really something that you don't have scoped rifles.
Well, let's
Uh,
say they did. Let's say they did.
mm,
Would because in that and I remember that scene. In the scene, the Duke was like, "Absolutely, you do not kill him."
yeah.
Would you think he would have made that call if he'd had the ability to just kill Napoleon at that point? Like, what do you think he would have done?
I don't know about what the Duke of Wellington would have done. What I can tell you is during the run up to that fight, when the British are fighting against the French in Spain, they're absolutely picking off officers with rifles. I mean, like
Yeah,
trying to kill the enemy leadership is something in America we kind of like, yeah, we invented this. Like our snipers shot the British officers during the Revolutionary War, and we did, and that's true to some extent.
of
But
course.
the Europeans are doing it before. Like in the
Right.
wars that I study in the 18th century, they're all lined up in lines, but you've got a couple of marksmen in each platoon. And so
Hmm.
when you see an enemy officer on the horse, trying to direct the brigade up the hill, you'll
Yeah.
turn to one of your riflemen or your marksmen and say, "Hey, get that colonel right there."
Yeah.
And that literally comes out of an 18th century Prussian officer, like a North German officer's
Right.
writing.
I mean, that makes sense,
Everybody's
of course, that from a tactical perspective, of course, you want to take out the leadership. I guess you can imagine a scenario where the Duke of Wellington is like, no, I want to beat him in the traditional way because I want him on my ship signing the papers, right? Like it's so there's an honor code, I suppose, that could be believable. I just don't know because we don't.
Yeah, and I mean there are moments like a British rifleman in the War of Independence like has Washington in his sights at the Battle of Brandywine and decides not to take the shot.
Interesting.
But he's an officer. So to some extent it's like a higher class officers don't always love shooting at other higher class officers.
That's
Um,
interesting. So how do we know that happened? Like what's the
Patrick Ferguson's the guy's name. He sort of writes about it after the war, or not during the war. He's actually killed in 1780. But yeah, I mean, it's a scene that likely did happen. I mean, it kind of depends on the perspective. Sometimes when it's like the head of state that
hmm
comes into play. Frederick II, the Great of Prussia, he sees some of his like light troops or like his like guerrilla fighters down in a ditch waiting to like waylay enemy officers. Like, what are you guys doing? Like, don't do that. But by the same token, does that sort of thing happen regularly all throughout the war? Yeah. I mean, so when the king is there, yeah, you play nice, but you sort of
Interesting.
break the rules otherwise. Yeah.
Yeah. That's super interesting. So okay, I guess let's move on then to the Revolutionary War. I mean, how did British soldiers think about the Revolutionary War? Where this was because I mean, a lot of these guys had been living in the colonies now for some time, I assume. You tell me. Was there mixed feelings about because it's what's funny is it's like back then, I mean, I don't know, I forget what I think it's called. I forget what the series was called. It was like Ichabod or something, and it was like this guy who goes back and forth from history.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'll never
Sleepy
forget this
Hollow.
line.
Sleepy Hollow. Yeah.
Yes, and there's this line he says, he's talking about Paul Revere, and he's like, the Paul Revere, this idea that Paul Revere said the British are coming, it made no sense because we were all British. Like, is that true? Is that
Yeah, I
how
mean,
they
he says the regulars are coming,
the
like the regular
regulars are
army
coming?
is
That
coming.
yeah,
Like
that's what he
that's
says
what
in the
he's
show. Yeah, that's accurate
yeah,
historically.
that is accurate. And I guess I would say most of the red-coated British soldiers are actually from like the UK. So they're from Ireland, they're from Scotland, they're from Wales, they're from England. Um, there are soldiers who are sort of on the loyalist side or fighting against George Washington from America who sign up to fight. There are men who were born in the UK, came to fight over here during the French and Indian War, and then settled in North America when that war is done. A lot of
Yeah,
them signed back up to fight for the British in sort of like
interesting.
the Revolutionary War. Um, their perspective, to some extent, the British perspective is the people who want to fight against the mother country are being led astray by fake news.
Mhm.
There's a soldier in the 15th Regiment of Foot who I looked at his letters in the Kent local record office. And basically he keeps saying, oh, the people are being misled. Like if only they weren't being misled, then everything would be all right. And so they look at this development of American sort of political autonomy that's something that's going on throughout the whole of the 18th century and essentially say, this isn't real. We don't accept this. This is fake news.
Yeah,
And so for a lot of the soldiers on the British side, they view the Americans as rebels.
yeah,
To be a rebel is not just. I mean, America today, it's like James Dean is a rebel. Like the Confederates are rebels. People think rebels are kind of sexy.
yeah.
In the 18th century world, if you're rebelling against the king, to some extent, that's a rebellion against God. And they look at scripture on both
Mm,
sides to try and justify this. There's a passage in Romans 13 that basically says like, submit to the governing authorities. And so like loyalists are preaching a lot from Romans 13 in the
right.
course of the run up to the Revolutionary War.
And of course, so are our founding fathers, right?
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
mean, um,
Absolutely. And they would look at this and they would interpret scripture through the principles of the Enlightenment and John Locke, and they
yeah,
would say, look, the people have a right to revolution if the prince or the king is not ruling in the people's best interest, sort of
right.
turning
Yeah,
back to that.
and they listed those, and I always love teaching people about the Declaration of Independence. It's a long. We focus on the first part, which is the most important part, but there's a long list of complaints that follow that, and they're written in the most polite manner possible. Like it is. It's just. It's. I love. You gotta love. You gotta appreciate how polite rebels were back then. But
Absolutely.
they make some good arguments, of course. And so that develops. There's an increasing frustration with British rule, and then George Washington starts to recruit. I mean, how does that recruitment start? If we're teaching kind of American History 101 here, how does that how
Mhm.
does that begin? How many people really sign up? And the other dirty little secret about this time period is, most of the population is like you know what's the right word? They're a little bit agnostic as to what's going on.
Yeah, like fence sitters, basically. They don't know
Yeah,
which side to fall down on. Yeah. So initially, the fighting starts 250 years ago this year in April, right? At Lexington and Concord. Historians talk about the military rage in 1775. Basically, in the early part of the war, it's not just like a regular Continental Army, it's just angry Americans showing up with guns.
mhm,
And so they're in like militias or in sort of like minute battalions, and they show up to fight on April 19th against the British at Lexington and Concord. And a large number of sort of ordinary Americans from the New England area
yeah.
show up to fight
Mel
against the
Gibson's,
British.
bunch of Mel Gibsons.
Exactly right. And from there, on June 14th, 1775, Washington is basically asked to go and turn this group of volunteers into a more professional army. Because militias are great if you're trying to deny territory from the enemy, if
Asked
you're trying to
asked by
bottle up
who?
the British in
Asked by who?
Boston.
The Continental Congress? Is that
Absolutely. The Continental Congress
okay?
it sort of forms this new Continental Army.
Right.
But militias aren't necessarily great at like launching offensive operations or taking and holding entrenched enemy positions. And so the Congress feels like we need a more professional army to actually kick the British out of Boston. And so
And this is
Washington,
and this is well before the Declaration in 1776. How did the
yeah,
when did the Continental Congress form?
I mean, so there are different iterations of it each year, but by 1774, they're meeting fairly regularly.
Right. And it formed because of this just growing need for the colonies to have a place to meet, to deal with this problem that is, I mean, how did that materialize?
Yeah, so a large degree it's a response to the Intolerable Acts, which is
Yeah.
the British trying to strangle American trade. They come in, they close the port of Boston, they deploy more regular soldiers, essentially as police forces
Mhm.
in Boston. They forbid Americans from assembling and like holding local elections and things
Right.
like this. And for a lot of Americans, that's especially in New England, that's the final straw. And
Yeah.
so as a
You're not
result,
letting us self-govern. I mean, that was part of the Declaration,
yeah,
right? It was
yeah,
one of the complaints was you're not allowing us to self-govern. I mean,
yeah,
I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what it said.
absolutely right.
And so you create this Continental Congress sort of forms, and it's essentially a shadow government.
Yeah, to some extent. And I mean, there are even like subcommittees across the colonies that are trying to not just be a shadow government, but also stockpile necessary like arms, munitions, money for
Mhm.
the war that they pretty much know is coming against the British.
Yeah. Okay. And so Washington is ordered to formalize this army, and they start, they actually start wearing uniforms, um, kind
To
of.
some extent, yeah. I mean, uniforms are expensive.
Yeah.
And so America doesn't have a ton of money. And
Right.
so early on in the war, we have a variety of military uniforms. There's a particular style of hunting garment in America that is called the hunting shirt. It's like a
Yeah.
almost like a beige linen shirt.
Yeah.
That's our first.
By the way, a much better tactical decision than red. I got,
Sure. I mean, so this is kind of a question, right? I mean, if you look at 18th century battle, when you're firing your gun down range today, you have the benefit that we have smokeless powder today, right? And so when you're firing your muskets in the 18th century, every time a battalion, I mean, imagine like 400 guys lined up. That's the basic infantry unit, battalion, all firing their guns at once. There's a huge cloud of smoke that's produced. And
Mhm.
so Washington has, his men in these linen beige jackets. It's a bit, it blends into the trees a bit more. There's some advantages. He really wants the army to be wearing standard uniforms, like essentially blue. So the British are wearing red, we're wearing blue. I don't think this is exactly where like NATO OPFOR, colors come from, but it's close in many ways, right? And so the idea is we want to be able to identify, are the guys we're shooting at enemies? We don't want to be engaged in friendly fire, something that happens a lot in the 18th century because there's so
Yeah, of
much smoke
course.
on these battlefields. But the
Well,
British are
does
wearing,
it happen? Does it happen a lot considering it's like one side versus the other? I mean, did they worry about the blue on blue? And I want to clarify for everyone what you just said. I know what you're talking about, but I don't think
yeah,
people do. In military jargon these days, we say the blue is us. That's like the allies. So blue on blue means, uh-oh, you killed one of your own guys. Blue on red means you killed an enemy. And then we have green, which usually like it refers to like our Afghan partners. So we have blue, green, and red, and that's kind of how we distinguish between who is who and quick, military jargon. Anyway, but keep going.
yeah. I mean, in these battles in the 18th century, friendly fire is a serious problem. Once the bat, I mean, imagine like you had large battles like the Battle of Long Island. You got 30,000 guys on the field, firing
Yeah.
their weapons. I mean, this amount of smoke generated is
I guess it
enormous.
becomes a problem once they mix, right? Because
Yeah,
eventually you're charging each other.
yeah,
Okay, so
absolutely.
you need to know who's who.
One of George Washington's formative experiences as a commander actually happens in the French and Indian War in 17 like 58 or 59 out in Western Pennsylvania. And he's leading a small group of British soldiers at that point, and they think they're going to run into some French, and they actually run into a friendly party, but neither of them knows that the other guys are friendly. And so fire is exchanged, and Washington realizes that essentially blue on blue is happening. And he's riding a horse. He goes out in front of his men who are shooting and takes his sword and like knocks up the muskets of the guys who are trying to fire because he's trying to get the men to cease fire because he doesn't obviously want to hurt his own troops.
Yeah, that's wild. And this all starts, and George Washington's like the old man. He's I think 44. I forget. it's around the 1970s when he's about 44, and like you look at all the rest of the founders and it's like 21, 23. I mean, these guys are like geniuses. They didn't have the internet. Imagine that. And so describe, I guess, your let's start with Concord and Lexington. I mean, how, from a tactical perspective, this is kind of what I'm more interested in. How did that start? It starts with the firing line and then it's just a melee? How does and how did Washington think about this? Because he's going up against, I think, what is considered the best army in the world at this point, right? Is that what the British are considered?
Yeah,
And so,
that's a really good question. And something I've thought a lot about. I mean, probably no. The British Army is the best funded army in the world at this point. But in terms of like tactical proficiency, probably either the Russians or the Prussians, which are like a North German army, they're probably actually the best. They're larger. They do a way more like realistic war games and trying to prepare their armies for combat. The British Army, it's okay man for man, but they don't do a lot of like large brigade and divisional training. And so the British are good fighting on like the level of a battalion, but they're not necessarily great at sort of putting it all together at the level of a brigade. But regardless, they're a very good army. They have a lot of funding. Their navy is the best navy in the world at this point, or one of the best navies in the world. And when we think about the fighting at Lexington and Concord and other sort of 18th century battles, they do line up, but really hand-to-hand combat is fairly rare. The bayonet is more of like a weapon of intimidation. If you're getting 25 yards away from a battalion of British soldiers who are advancing on your position, you're probably much more likely to say, I'm going to back off a bit than you are to mix it up with them in hand-to-hand combat.
yeah.
And so the goal is to take ground, to drive American forces out of like defensive positions. And so the British are, it's not really like the Patriot or Outlander or something like this, where the guys are in film always mixing it up in hand-to-hand combat. If you do get into hand-to-hand combat, you're probably fighting over like a trench or a defended obstacle rather than sort of being out in the open field.
Yeah. Well, how did Washington think about that? So what kind of tactics did Washington decide to utilize in order to overcome what it was a superior force?
So you mentioned the ages of the founding fathers. Washington is a really young man during that French and Indian War, like 20 years before our Revolutionary War. He thinks about how to fight the British in terms that make sense for a man of his generation. Like standard operating procedure was in the 1750s for the British Army, you want to hold your fire until really close range. You don't want the soldiers to shoot until the enemy comes up.
See the whites of their eyeballs.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And so Washington, in a lot of his tactical directives for the Continental Army, he's like, look, I know you guys prefer to fire at a longer distance, but if we really want to beat the British, we got to stop doing that. We got to let them come in close, and then we can blow them away at really close range.
And is this because we're not a well-funded army? We don't have, one, it takes a while to reload, and two, do we have a shortage of bullets and gunpowder? I mean,
yeah, absolutely,
we do. Yeah,
yeah. Compared to the British, they're going into action with like 40 or 50 rounds per man, which doesn't seem like a lot in a modern military context, right?
Yeah.
But it's a lot for the 18th century.
How long does it take them to reload?
An ordinary soldier in the 18th century can fire probably 3 to 4 shots a minute. So 15 seconds, 20 seconds.
It's not bad.
They're very well trained. We know this from the Continental Army. A French officer who's kind of working with Washington does a lot of like napkin math on how much ammo we need at Valley Forge. And he's like, well, if you assume the guys fire 3 rounds a minute, we need this much ammo. That's sort of one of the ways we come to conclusions like that. But we, the Americans, have a lot less ammo on average than the British. In certain battles, we're going into action with like 10 rounds or 20 rounds or 24 rounds. So the British maybe have double the amount of ammo we have, which is another reason Washington's like, guys, don't fire too early. You make the first shot count, fire at close range.
But at what point was there any kind of, guerrilla tactics begun to be used where, you might, God forbid, start flanking from covered positions? Again, like just as a Navy SEAL,
Sure.
That's how I would think about this.
Yeah, I mean, and flanking occurs in a lot of these field battles. Guerrilla warfare, militias, riflemen, light cavalry, it's all vital it doesn't necessarily win the big battles, but you're doing things like area denial, and trying to deny the enemy access to intelligence. If the
Hmm.
Continental Army is in camp and the British Army's like 10 miles away, you don't want them to know exactly where you are because they're going to come and force a battle, and Washington wants to avoid that. And so militia, like you imagine people like Mel Gibson in The Patriot, right? He's not necessarily decisive in terms of winning those field battles. What the guerrilla war does in our favor is prevent the British from gathering accurate intelligence, from controlling large portions of the countryside. To some extent, the Revolutionary War is a fight between the rural parts of America and the big cities. The British control the big cities. They control Boston for 1775. They control New York City for basically the whole war. They control
Yeah.
Charleston, South Carolina. Um, we control the countryside. And
Right.
we control the countryside by and large because of this guerrilla war, because of this area denial that
And
our
but is
militias.
Washington directing it? I mean, is there the way we would think about, again, the way I would think about it from a special operations perspective, it's like, yeah, these little, hitting this caravan isn't going to win the war, but it's certainly disruptive.
Yeah.
You look at Mel Gibson and The Patriot, and him and his boys just messing up this caravan. Well, that caravan's carrying bullets, it's carrying food, it's disruptive to the overall operation. You do enough of those, and you win the broader war. Of course, special operations don't win a war. You need special
Hmm.
operations are they're ancillary to the main effort. You still need conventional forces. I'm just curious as to like whether that conversation was playing out, or what, or was it more organic? Was it just like
Hmm.
mad Americans just getting together in militias and just you know what, we're just gonna go fight where we can, and Washington's doing his thing, and it just kind of all came together sort of naturally, or was it more planned out that way?
Yeah, so I guess I would say kind of a mix of both. I mean, Washington's not like planning every raid himself, right? I mean,
Hmm.
he's managing the conventional army. With that said, we do have a lot of pretty close interaction between various militia groups, and the Continental Army. So they're kind of reading from the same playbook.
Yeah,
They have each other's objectives in mind.
and they're
At times, will
communicating.
detach forces to work alongside the militia.
Right.
Like the professional forces and the militia forces working together in these hit and run attacks.
Is there a specific instance where there was a particularly a particularly impressive victory for these guerrilla type militias?
I mean, yeah, if you think about the war in the South, particularly in South Carolina, North Carolina, people like Sumter and Francis Marion are very effective guerrilla fighters. And especially there, they're able to do what they do because the British have these incredibly long supply lines that they're able to
Mhm.
hit pretty regularly. I mean, the if you imagine from the British perspective, the war is a little bit more like the global war on terror of Vietnam. They're trying to
Yeah.
really control vast distances with an economy of force.
Hmm.
And so as a result, these militia groups, like those led by Francis Marion, are able to hit the British supply lines where they're vulnerable. You can't do that in New York City as much because the British have their own kind of light infantry and specialist forces
Yeah.
that are sort of keeping the militias at bay in the areas around New York City.
How much does cavalry play a role in this? Again, you look at like the movie Napoleon, there's huge cavalry regiments. You look at movies of the Revolutionary War, you don't see a whole lot of that. Yet it's not as if we don't have a bunch of horses in America. So
Yeah.
how did that play a role?
Sure, absolutely. So cavalry is much more important as like a battlefield arm over in Europe because you have huge horse farms, you have a lot of men who are trained in terms of heavy cavalry operations. In America, cavalry is still used and it's even used vitally in combat, especially in the South. But it's often used to kind of support these hit and run operations. So the British light cavalry will be trying to like track down our militias, and our light
Hmm.
cavalry will be in some cases like mounted infantry. We have infantry units that basically like ride to the battlefield, then fight dismounted, then get back on their horses and ride away. So these are it's not so much like giant charges where you like the end of Lord of the Rings, where you're like thousands of cavalrymen charging across the battlefield at each other. But you do still have cavalry playing a vital role in like those shaping operations outside New York City, in the South, as we're trying to hunt down the British special forces. They're trying to hunt us down.
Well, did we have any technological advantages? People talk about the American long rifle. Was there anything we had that they didn't have that was especially advantageous?
So I would say a huge technological or not, a huge advantage is American gun culture, right? I mean, we own more firearms than the British do. Our ordinary soldiers, enlisted men, are more used to firearms at a younger
Mhm.
age than they are. And that doesn't mean we're perfect. Washington writes in a letter to a general named Alexander McDougall, who's like a brigadier general in the Continental Army, that recruits in our army from Europe, so like Irish guys fighting in the Continental Army, they don't really know quite how to load and work the guns as effectively as Native Americans do, or
Mm.
Americans who are born in America.
Yeah.
Um, but by the same contrast, the European recruits are way more used to like 400 men firing in a battalion at once than the Americans are.
Yeah.
So we have an advantage in this gun culture that probably is most prominently known in the use of American long rifles.
Yeah.
Um, the British have rifles too. Their German allies, the Hessians, have a whole bunch of riflemen who fight alongside them. So it's not necessarily that one side has the technology decisively in their advantage. We probably use the rifles more and to better effect, especially in the early part of the war. But as the war goes on, I mean, it's like, I mean, imagine a situation where like every infantryman in the U.S. Army has a 50 caliber Barrett, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that wouldn't really work super well in a modern context.
Mhm.
It might be great at engaging the enemy in long distance, but to actually take and hold operations like clear buildings, you would want guys with M4s.
Mhm.
Well, it's the same is true in the 18th century. That the American long rifles like the Barrett, the
Mhm.
musket, the Charleville French musket, or the Brown Bess, British musket, it's more like an M4. You can put a bayonet on the end. You can reload it a
Interesting.
lot faster. So you can use it it's more flexible. You can use it in a variety of situations. But if you need to make that 300 plus yard shot and kill a British officer, you really want to have one of those long rifles. That is the decisive advantage that we have.
That's interesting. Um, and will give us a little bit of insight on how, if you have the literature on this, or the letters written by American soldiers at the time and some of their perspectives. There was some obviously some times when they thought they were going to lose. It was, and morale was low, and they was having a hard time getting ammo and getting food. I mean, how did Washington keep that together, and what were some of those highs and lows?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So I guess I would say Washington handles it and the Continental Congress handles it in a couple of ways. First, Washington, he's not, if he was a football coach, he probably wouldn't be retained. He's got like a 50-50 battlefield win-loss record. But generals are not football coaches, and strategic objectives in a war are much more important than like your battlefield win-loss rate. And so as a result of this, he is, especially in 1776, in the earlier part of the war, getting beat by the British fairly badly. It looks like we're going to lose the war. The ordinary soldiers are like, man, do I really want to stay in this army? In a period right after Christmas in 1776 into 1777, in what some historians now call the 10 Crucial Days, Washington launches a snap counterattack at the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And
Mhm.
there, he kind of keeps the revolution alive. He doesn't cripple the British army, but he nabs some sort of isolated enemy garrisons. And this restores morale that had kind of been sagging on the Continental Army. So Washington is a great general, not necessarily because he always wins on the battle. Like he's not Napoleon, but he does know when he's got to sort of launch an offensive operation to try and restore momentum to his side when that's kind of flagging. The other thing I'll say is very early in the war, it is a story of like angry Americans showing up with guns. And
Mhm.
that works out really well in 1775 and 1776. But by that point, most of those kind of really ideologically motivated middle class guys who had sort of volunteered to fight initially, their terms of service are up and they're ready to be done. They've kind of done their time in the army. We won
Yeah.
some, we lost some. They're ready to go home. And so increasingly as the war goes on, we rely on soldiers who are professionals in that they care about the cause, certainly. They also want to get paid.
Yeah.
And we increasingly turn to things like conscription.
Yeah.
States like New Jersey and states like North Carolina, we say, hey, we need this many militiamen per county to
Yeah.
actually go join the Continental Army. So it's sort of a mix of those factors that keeps us in the
And
fight
does
long enough.
does the public perception, we talked about that a minute before, there was kind of a lot of fence sitters. Does the public perception improve over time? Or does
Yeah.
it improve along with these battlefield wins like Trenton and Princeton?
So I would say we used to think it was like a third, a third, and a third. A third were 33% were really pro-independence. 33% were kind of, we don't know either way. 33% were supported the British. It actually comes from a letter of John Adams. Today, based on a lot of demographic research, historians would say it's closer, like 50% want independence,
Mhm.
25% don't care either way, 25% support the British. So
Yeah,
we do have, maybe not a full majority, but a plurality of Americans on our side in the war. So that helps.
yeah,
With that said, a lot of Americans are really skeptical of the professional army, the Continental Army. They view that as being almost like a symptom of like big government. Do we really need a professional army to win this war? Couldn't the militias just do all the fighting? A
right,
lot of
right.
Americans are
Mhm.
kind of asking themselves that.
We still
Um,
are.
yeah. And
Most aren't,
so
but some still are. Yeah.
yeah, exactly right. And so by the time the war is done, and a great historian, he's deceased now, but a great historian named Charles Royster kind of writes about this in a book called A Revolutionary People of War. I think it came out back in the 70s. And basically his argument is the Continental Army and the American people are really kind of in cahoots and working together at the beginning of the war. As the war goes on, the American people start saying like, yeah, we're supporting this Continental Army. You're not really winning the war. Like, what's going on? Like, come on, we got stuff to do. Like, hurry up and beat the British. And the Continentals soldiers also feel like, man, we're putting it all out there. We're risking our lives for this population, and they're not very grateful.
Yeah.
And so there's
That's
some
hard.
resentment that builds up
Yeah.
on both sides.
Yeah, that's interesting. And a lot of things don't change. I mean, I
Absolutely.
think of Vietnam veterans,
Yeah.
and the horrors. What are our losses? It's actually something I don't know. I mean, what's the casualty rate throughout
It's
the
something like
Revolutionary War?
24,000 Americans die in the course of the war. A lot of those are from disease rather than like killed in action or mortally wounded.
When does it officially end? What year?
1783. So it's an 8-year war, basically.
Yeah. And then we start our conversations about the Constitution and all that.
Yeah.
And it ends. So we'll fast forward a little bit. We get past Trenton and Princeton, and in our final battle, the French come in, and Marquis de Lafayette helps us
Mm.
out. This is a decisive battle, and it wraps up. Maybe summarize that for us real quick.
Sure, absolutely. So the turning point of the war is really in 1777. There are two big campaigns, one in like upstate New York in the area around Saratoga, the other around Philadelphia. As a result of that, the French and other European powers decide to they've kind of been like covertly helping us up until this point. They say we're going to give the Americans money and guns and in some case actual military support. And so by the war kind of drags on, we're kind of attriting the British, especially in the South. Um, Washington in 1781 has kind of a big strategic choice. He has spent the last like 3 years of his life planning for how he's going to kick the British out of New York City. That's all of his sort of efforts and ideas are focused on how do I liberate New York City from the British.
Right. You do that, it's a big blow. It could end the war.
Absolutely, yeah, like a decisive stroke. But then he gets word that the British Army is in Virginia. They've come up from South Carolina, up through North Carolina, into
How
coastal
big? How
Virginia.
how big is the British Army?
I mean, if we're looking all around the world, like over 100,000
No,
guys.
no, no,
Deployed
just in
in
America.
America here, I mean, overall, probably about 50,000 men, depending on the year of the war. Individual British field armies, usually smaller than 10,000 guys, maybe 5,000, 4,000 guys,
Okay, but
even
we've got
less.
about 50,000 British redcoats in America. They
Mhm.
could send more. They decide not to.
Because they're
Curious.
fighting a global war, right? The revolution's
Right.
a world war. They got to fight against the French and the Spanish and the Dutch all over the world.
Yeah. Yeah, they're in over their heads. And
Yeah.
how big was at our height? How big were we?
So I mean that's a difficult question for historians to answer because it's all militia is all across the colonies. But I would say at any one time, Washington probably has about 20,000 men under his direct command.
Mhm.
The French send over, depending on what year of the war we're talking about, 10,000 plus troops to come help us. So it's if you include all the militia, it's probably after 1778 about equal. We probably have about 50,000 men under arms.
Hmm.
They have probably about 50,000 men under arms. Actually, I just was researching this in detail for a Twitter thread a couple days ago. We actually outnumber the British in the battles more often than not.
Interesting.
Usually we have a numbers edge of like 2,000 men if we're looking at, on average, the battles of the Revolutionary War. When they do outnumber us, though, it's by a large margin, like 3,000 or more guys. So it's, but especially later in the war, the British have fewer troops. A lot of their troops are either defending their home islands, deployed to Gibraltar, fighting in India. The troops that are left in America are usually outnumbered by us, and that's one of the reasons why we start to see a lot of success in the later years of the Revolutionary War.
I'm curious what like the historians look at the conversations in London afterwards. Should we have stopped fighting a multi-front war and put more resources here? Was there regret afterwards? Was there how did they think about that?
So well, certainly, I think there's a lot of regret. I mean, they don't like losing the war, but with that said, they're kind of, especially the ministers, are looking at this through the perspective of like dollars and cents, like how do we pay for our empire?
Mhm.
And something we don't think about a lot in America, but if you look at that global war, except for where they're fighting us, the British actually do pretty well. They pick up some islands in the Caribbean. They keep their naval base in Gibraltar, against the French and the Spanish. They actually win the war on the ground in India, like the subcontinent of India. They're fighting
Mhm.
against the French at the same time. Um, Obviously, losing out on your sort of prime real estate in America absolutely stinks. But the British statesmen after 1778, they're basically playing damage control. Like they're facing and losing a massive global war, and they're trying to prioritize. The sugar production, sugar is a huge, like, high value commodity in the 18th century. The sugar production in the Caribbean is in some ways more vital to them to preserve than parts of America. They
Right.
would have liked to hold on to, certain American states.
Yeah.
That obviously doesn't end up happening.
No, it doesn't. And yeah, I guess from their perspective, it's like, are we fighting this out of pride at a certain point?
Mm,
And I wonder if
sure.
that's and I wonder if that's how soldiers felt on the ground. Like what at a certain point, as they start to lose and Americans start to actually gain a better footing, what is the British soldiers' reaction to that?
I think a lot of the professional soldiers, like think about Roger Lamb. He's a pretty famous British soldier who writes a memoir of what it was like to be in combat in the American War. He kind of and he's writing like 20 years after the fact, so you take some of it with a grain of salt, but he kind of leans into the narrative of, sort of like, a few band of brothers, like, we're outnumbered by the Americans, we're on the offensive trying to chase down American armies. We did the best we could in a really difficult situation, so you have that narrative. But in terms of pride, like, yeah, it probably would have been better for the British to make a deal with us earlier on. Their position in 1778 is much better than their position in 1781. And so as the war goes on, they're facing losses, and they can't really come back from them. The French Navy, and kind of one of the oddities of history, the French Navy is probably better than the British Navy by the close of the war.
Hmm.
They're able to stop the British Navy from coming to, like, pick up Charles Cornwallis, the British general in
Right.
Yorktown. So
Well,
it's like a sunk cost
yeah.
fallacy, right? I mean, the
Yeah.
British are trying to say, how much blood and treasure have we spent? What can we possibly get out of this? Do we want to hang on? Do we want to give up?
Yeah. Let's talk about French involvement for a second. I think again, some of this is just some basic history lessons for me and the audience. We're all familiar with Marquis de Lafayette, right? There's a picture of Washington and Lafayette on the House floor. He's an important person for us. I think it's in general American history, we understand his intervention to come at the very end and have that decisive battle. I'm forgetting the name of the battle. Uh,
Yorktown.
Yorktown, which ends the war. Am I correct?
Yeah,
And
more or
then there's
less.
the Treaty of Versailles. My,
Treaty of Paris, absolutely right.
Treaty of Paris. Treaty of Versailles was a different world war.
Yeah.
And but the French had been involved for the years following up to that. You said, 10,000 troops at a time or like total, like
Yeah, I mean,
their
at a time.
involvement.
So they send an
That's a
expedition
lot.
over. It is. It's a huge commitment. And especially, I mean, if you're like the French king, you've just fought this big French and Indian War, 7 years war, where the British whooped up on your navy. So like sending 10,000 men in an expeditionary force across the Atlantic, it's a huge gamble that they're taking kind of on our behalf because they hope that tying British forces down in America will help them win a larger global war.
And
Um,
that kind of answers my next question because the geopolitics of this are interesting,
hmm,
and there's a lot of and they're interesting for our lessons today. Because we have these debates today about, well, why do I care about what happens in Europe? I mean, the French seem to care, and it was a 3 month journey. How long did it take to
yeah,
cross the
like two
Atlantic?
months across the Atlantic, absolutely.
It's a 9 hour journey now. The world is far smaller than it used to be, and yet. The French weren't stupid. They did not make these. These were not stupid people. They made these decisions based on geostrategic interests.
Absolutely.
And I remind people of that a lot. I'm like, why do you care? Because the world is so much smaller than it used to be. And even back then,
Hmm.
allies cared. Why? To bog them down here so that you can have an advantage here. And it's an interesting historical point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the French, they don't necessarily love what we're, I mean, they have a monarchy too, right? They don't like the idea of getting rid of the king, or at least not at that moment. But when people like Lafayette come back to France, the King of France says, you can't wear your medals that you won in America, like that you won those fighting for a Republican government, not for a monarchy. So even though ideologically we're a bit different from the French, they view those geostrategic interests to be so vital that they're
Yeah.
willing to come and help us
It
out.
wasn't because they liked us. It just made sense for their strategic interests to
Yeah.
to weaken the British. And so what's interesting too is how much our military is still modeled after the European militaries. Actually, wait, one more question on the chronological events real quick. So the Treaty of Paris happens. What happens to the 50,000 British soldiers that are just kind of stuck on the mainland? Like how does that work? Do they just get on boats and leave and everyone's like
Yeah.
goodbye? Like there's no.
So there's like a timetable essentially that is given to evacuate.
Mhm.
And we like they evacuate Charleston, South Carolina, they evacuate New York City. Essentially they pull back all of their um forces that are they're engaged in like area denial in right outside the cities, into the cities. They put the men on ships. They go back to Europe from there.
Yeah, and
Or Nova
why
Scotia.
why was this in Paris? Because it's not like Paris was this neutral third country. Why and who was there? Who went
Sure.
there and signed this? Like what happened?
Yeah, I mean, well, a number of founding fathers there, but Ben Franklin's one of our main diplomats, is sort of
Yeah, well, he was
involved
there
in
like the whole time, right? Just
exactly
being
right,
French. I
exactly right.
mean, the movies are what is it? The show John Adams depicts
Yeah,
it probably pretty accurately. I don't know,
it really,
and he was
yeah,
key in
I love that
convincing them
series.
too. I mean, that was a really interesting show. It's like, in the way he taught John Adams, like, hey, stop. It's not all business. You got to party with them for like a while, and then and wear their weird makeup, and and then you got to get them to like you.
Right.
It's just fascinating. And, so it wasn't obvious that the French were just like going to make that decision. It took some serious diplomacy on the part of Ben Franklin, mostly, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, Paris in some ways, I mean, today when a lot of Americans think of Europe, we think of like London as being the center of the European world. In the 18th century, London's a really important city. But culturally, like all the elites, I mean, even in Russia, like the nobles all speak French. And
Hmm.
so it's kind of sort of a natural meeting point. I mean, the end of the French and Indian Wars negotiated in a Peace of Paris. The end of the revolutions negotiated in the Peace of Paris. It's just you basically got to
It's
go with
just
the
the
French
place you
king.
go.
Yeah,
Interesting.
exactly, exactly.
Okay. What other founding fathers were there? Just curious.
Yeah, so you've got John Adams, Ben Franklin. There are I want to say I think by this point John Adams' son is actually like in the Netherlands. John Quincy Adams, our future president. Um, but yeah, I mean, Franklin and Adams are sort of the two main figures in
Hmm.
negotiating essentially what we want out of this treaty. And I don't necessarily think we get everything we want. We would have desperately liked to have some of Canada. I mean that would have not
Hey,
been
it's
the
on.
worst.
It's still on the
Not too
table.
late. Not too late. Yeah. We'll see what happens. Yeah, this is a hard conversation for me. I have a Canadian
We need to
grandfather
liberate Canada.
too.
We need
Um,
to-
But yeah, I mean, we invade Canada in 1775, and like right after the war begins, we try again in the War of 1812. I mean, we just want that sweet, sweet maple syrup.
It's so damn cold. I don't know why. Okay, now we got that question answered. It's very interesting stuff. Our military is very much modeled after the British military and perhaps other European militaries as well. I mean, to outsiders, they cannot possibly understand the difference between officer and enlisted. It just doesn't make sense. You just kind of have to live it to understand why it actually makes a lot of sense and works really, really well. What lessons did America learn as we went, and then went into the War of 1812? And since we have a little bit of time, maybe a quick history lesson on the War of 1812. So the British are coming back. Like how did that materialize? I mean, this isn't that long after the Revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So answering the first question first, so like our professionalism, the structure of our military, we do really sort of follow in European molds. To a large extent, I think as Americans today, we're really proud of the way that our army is unique. We're proud of the guerrilla fighting. We're proud of the long riflemen. In many ways, George Washington is trying to make the army more European throughout the war. He wants to have a professional military that looks more like the British Army so that he can launch offensive operations and do what he needs to do. And so as a result, we bring over people like my college's mascot, Baron Steuben, or Freiherr die Steuben is how he would have called himself in the 18th century. He is a Prussian soldier, so a soldier from Germany, basically North Germany, who shows our army how to fight more effectively, tries to push us more into that European mold.
Yeah, but is that a good idea? Does it work?
Yeah, I mean, I would say broadly, if you look at the outcomes in the battles after when he comes over, we start winning more fights. We start doing more damage to the British Army. You can do a lot of attritional damage to the British with just militia forces. If you actually want to inflict battlefield defeats, push them back closer to the cities, you eventually want to launch a siege operation to take those cities.
Yeah.
You need a professional military, and that's one of the things that Steuben gives us.
Yeah, what we would call today is a conventional military, I suppose. Yeah. You need both.
Absolutely.
And so walk us through then forward in time to the War of 1812. How do we get back into a fight as such a young country?
Yeah, absolutely. To some extent, it's because the British still kind of view us as like their little brother they can push around.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily trying to reconquer America. Sometimes you hear it called like the Second War for Independence or something like this. And that's not really on the table. The British are never going to take back the United States at this point. But what you do have is disputes over land. The Americans would really love to have Canada. Thomas Jefferson writes in a letter in sort of the summer of 1812, the conquest of Canada this year will be a mere matter of marching. We just have to go and it'll all collapse. More importantly, I think for many Americans politically, the British are pushing us around on the high seas, kind of interfering with our maritime rights. And so we haven't
built
British
a very
ships.
strong Navy yet.
Exactly. We have like 6 heavy frigates. I mean, they're really impressive ships. You can go see the Constitution today, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
One of a few ships remaining
That's
from
where we
this time.
get commissioned in Boston then. So
Absolutely. But basically the British Army, British Navy, excuse me, is enormous. They're stopping our ships and essentially like looking over our personnel rosters and for like merchant ships and saying, at this point, 1812, the British are in an existential struggle against Napoleon and France. And so they say, it's kind of an all hands on deck situation for England. We need all the guys who were born in the UK to be sort of sail and fight for the British Navy. So if you're stopping an American ship that has Irish-born sailors on it and taking those Irish-born sailors off with Marines and saying, now you guys were born in territory controlled by the UK, you belong to us, not to America.
interesting.
That kind of makes sense, I guess, from the British perspective, but it's a huge problem from the American perspective.
Yeah, you're
We're a real
kidnapping our
country. You can't
people.
just push us around, right? You can't just steal our people. So we asked them to stop in a series of strongly worded diplomatic letters.
Yeah,
Um, One of the oddities, they do kind of stop. They at least are willing to like negotiate with us, but with that 2 month journey that you mentioned across the Atlantic, that willingness to negotiate gets to us by the time we've already declared war on them. And so as a result, we go into combat. Twitter doesn't exist in the
right,
early 19th
right.
century, right? There's not as communication.
So what does going into war with them look like exactly? What's our first move?
Yeah, so I mean, the first move is we want to try and invade Canada over land,
Okay.
especially like the Niagara Falls frontier.
Hmm.
It's one of the most heavily fortified places on Earth in that time. There are a whole bunch of fortresses on the British side, there are a whole bunch of fortresses on the American side. Kind of the reverse of what we expect ends up becoming true. Our Navy does pretty well in the War of 1812, at least on like a ship by ship basis. Our frigates are fast enough to get away from anything heavier than them and heavy enough to outfight anything the British have in a similar size. But our army really does struggle to invade Canada. We try to invade Canada at several points throughout this war. We capture a couple of key fortresses, but it's not really enough to move the needle. We do have a lot of success fighting Native Americans like Tecumseh, who's a Shawnee war leader out in like Ohio and Michigan and Upper Canada. But it's essentially a draw.
How populated is Canada at this point in time?
Yeah, we have like I think 4 million people, and they have like maybe 40,000. I want to say I looked this up a couple weeks ago, but the number is eluding me.
Yeah, it's cold up there. I mean,
It is. It
but
is.
so what was the strategic purpose of them wanting to take Canada? Just autonomy, generally speaking, to keep the British just off the doorstep. Is that
Yeah, I mean, really, the point you just raised, keeping the British off the doorstep. So the British are using Canada as a base to fund and arm Native American groups who don't like the United States, and so they're
okay?
passing a lot of money and weapons into the hands of
Yeah,
leaders like Tecumseh.
yeah.
And
They've still
so,
got a chip on their shoulder about the whole revolution. Hasn't
absolutely right.
one of the more interesting little pieces of history in War of 1812. So the British, I mean, this war obviously escalates and they invade Washington, D.C.
Mhm.
Right? Am I thinking about the right war?
No, you're absolutely right.
The burn down they attempt to burn down the Capitol. I mean, we have there's offices you can go to and visit, and where and in this particular window of this office, it's now a window, but that's where the British troops actually entered that
Yeah.
day. Tried to burn down the Capitol, and apparently we had a giant rainstorm that actually put out the flames that day.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. Yeah. So the British take their large, heavy battleships, like their 74 gun and larger battleships, to Tangier Island in Chesapeake Bay. And they use that as a naval base to launch a lot of raids on Virginia, on Maryland, on DC. The American military, because the British are using amphibious operations to basically like gain operational mobility against us. We can't quite catch up with them in their speed in these raids. I
Hmm.
will also say the institution of slavery really works against us in this war.
Yeah,
So there are a lot of young African American men who the British show up and they say, "Hey, you want to come fight in the British Army? We'll liberate you. We'll liberate your family." And they jump
yeah.
at this chance, right?
Uh,
And so there's a whole military unit called the Corps of Colonial Marines that's formed out of young black men who want to fight on the British side. They act as both kind of soldiers and guides for the British Army.
hmm.
But so that's one way the British kind of identify maybe a weakness in American society and try to exploit that weakness.
Yeah.
They do raid DC. They say the raid is a retribution for essentially we tried to like light Toronto on fire. And they come in. They do try to burn down the White House. They do try to burn down the Capitol building. As you noted, both of these structures. I mean, the White House is a little bit more torched than the Capitol, but both of the structures survive as a result of that rainstorm. But the commander, a guy named George Cogburn, is so proud of this that when he goes to get his portrait painted like 30 years later, he's like, "Yeah, put DC on fire in the background of my sort of officer portrait."
Yeah, I get that, I guess. That's super interesting. We're hitting up our hour now. Any last words? Maybe on what you got a book coming out, you said?
Yeah,
on
yeah. So
Thursday. What's
that book is more about like the background of the Revolutionary War, like how George Washington and the soldiers who fought alongside him kind of learned to fight in the 18th century and brought some of that to the
Mhm.
Revolution. Um, and specifically, it's sort of that dichotomy that you mentioned earlier, that you like the enlisted men versus officers. Like, does it work? What does that look like? And so I try to look in terms of how do the officers want battles to go versus how did the battles actually unfold? Like,
Mhm.
in what way do these troops like negotiate authority? I mean, it's all well and good to tell your men, hey, I need you to go up in close range and assault that earthwork. But if you're not like leading from the front inspirationally, are they going to follow through on that command?
Yeah.
So I try to look at the negotiation of authority. Soldiers like it best when you lead from the front. And so a lot of the kind of advice that officers, older officers, are giving to younger officers. One German soldier basically says, you go out, you want to be there with your guys that are, sort of out like pulling security. You want to be with them at the forefront of the action. You want to die alongside them. You want to be there with your guys. And so we often look at the 18th century. They're like, yeah, like General Cornwallis is, wearing a powdered wig, and he wasn't. But how serious can these noble officers be? A lot of them take the profession of arms really seriously, and they do kind of live alongside and fight alongside their men. And when they lead inspirationally in that way, the soldiers respond better to it. And so that's one of the things I unpack in this book. It's called
Yeah.
Infantry in Battle.
Well, I mean, Washington was obviously beloved. And so, how in his case, how much did he really get into the mix the way maybe we view Napoleon got into the mix all the time?
Yeah, I mean he certainly leads from the front. I mean he is acting at moments in these revolutionary battles, very very close to the front lines, almost like a brigadier general. And so the idea, maybe that we might have in America today, where officers are in the danger, absolutely, but higher commanders, brigadier generals and above, they might not be out, on patrol with the squad. That is not quite as true in the Revolutionary War. And there are moments, like at the Battle of Brandywine, where I mentioned, where if Patrick Ferguson had decided to take the shot, he might have been able to kill Washington.
That would
You
have been
mentioned the Marquis de
quite the change in
Lafayette.
history. Yeah.
He actually comes over he's like 17. He comes over as a volunteer in 1777. He gets bayoneted by the British in the leg at the Battle of Brandywine.
Wow.
So I mean, these officers, they don't just kind of tell the men what to go do. They actually lead from the front in ways that are very dangerous for them.
I guess last question. What are some of the lessons you've seen that have been adapted over time, from the lessons of this kind of military history or 18th century warfare to now? Or is warfare now so different that you're comparing apples and oranges?
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I do think there's both continuity and change. I mean, it's really easy to look at a period where the guys are like lining up in brightly colored coats and shooting each other. Like, how seriously can we take this? But at the same time, there's a lot of continuities. The ordinary infantrymen, they're taking cover. They're lying down under fire. They're taking actions, even though they're with smoothbore weapons. You're not quite firing it as accurately at longer distances. They're taking actions to mitigate the risk to themselves. I will also say, I mean, you look at the war in Ukraine today, artillery is causing a lot of the casualties on those
Mhm.
battlefields. That happened in World War One. That happened in World War Two. Artillery kills more soldiers than any other combat arm in
Mhm.
those wars. That's true in the 18th century as well. A lot of these cannons, they will fire like anti-personnel munitions that basically turn the
Mhm.
cannon into a giant shotgun.
Yeah.
Artillery kills more men in 18th century wars just as it does here in the 21st century. I mean, there are other things you could look at. I mean, I think the inspirational leadership that Washington displays is kind of like what we would hope from the best of our military traditions today.
Yeah. It was interesting too. Like I said, like the general structure is not changed in centuries. I don't know when the British really started their. Do you know the answer to that? I mean, when did this officer enlisted structure actually begin?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, it comes out of like the ways that armies used to be organized in Europe with the nobility, like even back in the Middle Ages. But a lot of the more modern ideas of we're going to have enlisted men, and then we're going to have like NCOs maybe in the middle, and then we're going to have officers. That comes out of the army reforms of Louis XIV. There's a very important French king who lives in the early part of George Washington's century, the very beginning of the 1700s. He's an old man, and so a lot of modern military rank structures across a lot of modern armies, the Russian army, the German army, our army, it all kind of, in one way or another, it draws back to this French guy who's basically like a trendsetter in his time.
Yeah, it's interesting, and that doesn't appear to ever change anytime soon, and probably for good reason. It works. Fascinating conversation. Where do people follow you on Twitter?
Yeah, absolutely. You can follow me. You just look up Alexander S. Burns is my name, but you can follow me at K Krieg blog. It's the blog that I run. Kabinettskrieg is what the Germans call this period of warfare. But K Krieg blog is my Twitter handle. You can find my books if you look at my name on Amazon, or my publisher Hellion and Company over in the UK would like me to tell you to go to their website. But wherever you can find the books is I'm happy with it.
Ironic that your publisher's in the UK, I guess.
It is. It is.
Well, Alexander, thank you so much for being on. It's been fascinating. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks so much, Congressman.